Story 1. Grave in the Woods. I've always loved hiking. It's one of those things that clears my mind and makes me feel like I'm part of something bigger. Last summer, my best friend Nathan and I decided to tackle a trail deep in the wilderness of Oregon. We'd heard about it from a local hikers forum. It wasn't on any official maps, but the photos people posted of the dense trees and untouched terrain made it look too good to resist. We were both in our late 20s, bored of our office jobs, and craving some adventure. That particular Saturday, we packed up early, loaded the car, and hit the road before dawn. Little did we know. It was the kind of trip that stays with you forever, not because of the views, but because of what we found. The trail started out peaceful enough, while calling it a trail might be an exaggeration. It was more like a faint path beaten down by animal hooves, or maybe a few brave souls before us. The forest was unusually quiet that morning. Birds chirped faintly, but there was this stillness in the air. I remember making a joke to Nathan about how the forest felt like it was holding its breath. He just laughed and shook his head, saying I was being dramatic. We kept walking, the trees getting denser and the sunlight struggling to cut through the canopy. The air smelled damp, earthly-like. The ground had soaked up years of rain and secrets. That's when we noticed the ground ahead looked disturbed, like someone had been digging recently. At first, I thought it might just be a fallen tree or a shallow animal den. But as we got closer, it became clear. It was a grave, a freshly dug grave, right there in the middle of nowhere. The dirt was loose, darker than the surrounding soil, and there were faint marks around it, like someone had hurriedly tried to cover it up. My chest tightened, and I glanced at Nathan, whose face had gone pale. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the breeze. We both stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something or someone was watching us from behind the trees. Nathan grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "Do you see that?" he murmured, his voice shaky. My eyes darted to the tree line where I'd seen the movement. At first it was just a shadow, blending seamlessly with the dark trunks and thick undergrowth. Then I noticed a figure, standing unnaturally still, its silhouette barely visible against the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but there was something wrong about the way it stood. It didn't sway with the wind, didn't adjust its weight. It was just there, watching. I wanted to turn back, to head straight for the car, but Nathan was already moving closer to the grave. "Don't," I hissed, but he ignored me, kneeling to get a better look at the disturbed earth. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the grave, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, just a glint beneath the loose dirt. "We should leave," I insisted, my voice louder this time. Nathan, always the braver or stupider of the two of us, reached out and brushed some of the dirt aside. That's when we both froze. Sticking out of the soil was the corner of something metallic-like, the edge of a box or a case, barely buried. Before we could react, a snapping sound came from the woods, loud and deliberate, like someone stepping on a dry branch. The figure moved then, just a little, leaning forward, as if to get a better look at us. My stomach dropped. "We're not alone," I whispered. Nathan finally seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He stood up slowly, his flashlight still trained on the grave, but his other hand reached for my arm, pulling me back toward the path. "We need to go," he muttered, and for once, I didn't argue. As we started to back away, the figure disappeared, melting into the shadows like smoke. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, but Nathan yanked me forward, his urgency snapping me out of my daze. We turned and began walking quickly back the way we came. The forest suddenly feeling much darker than it had before. The trail that had seemed so straightforward earlier now felt confusing, almost foreign, as if the woods themselves were trying to keep us from leaving. The air felt thicker, and the faint sounds of rustling leaves seemed to follow us. The snapping branches grew closer, more insistent, until they were almost directly behind us. I couldn't bring myself to look back, convinced that if I did, I'd see whatever had been watching us from the trees. Nathan, however, wasn't as cautious. He glanced over his shoulder and swore under his breath. "It's following us," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't ask what he saw. I didn't want to know. We broke into a jog, the underbrush snagging at our clothes, and the uneven ground threatening to trip us with every step. Just when I thought we were putting some distance between us and the grave, we hit a dead end. The path suddenly stopped, replaced by a dense wall of trees that hadn't been there earlier. "This doesn't make any sense," Nathan muttered, spinning around to find another way out. The snapping noises stopped then, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. That's when we saw the figure, now much closer, standing just a few feet away. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was obscured by shadow. But there was something gleaming where its eyes should have been. "Run," Nathan said, his voice barely a whisper. We bolted in the opposite direction, desperate to find the trail again. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but fear kept me moving. The forest seemed endless, every tree looking the same, every sound amplifying the sense that we were being herded, like prey. It wasn't until we stumbled into a clearing, a place we hadn't passed before, that we finally stopped. Nathan doubled over, gasping for air, while I scanned the tree line, expecting the figure to emerge at any moment. That's when we saw the second grave. This one was smaller, more crudely dug, but the dirt was just as fresh. Nathan let out a choked gasp and pointed to something lying near the edge of the clearing. It was a shovel, dirt still clinging to the blade, and next to it, a small leather notebook. Nathan hesitated, staring at the notebook as though it might bite him. "Don't," I started, but he was already reaching for it. His hands trembled as he flipped open the cover. The pages were filled with writing, uneven scrawls that looked more like a deranged manifesto than coherent notes. Some of it was illegible, but certain words stood out, scratched over and over. "Bury them, it watches, the forest feeds." The last page was the worst. It wasn't words but a crude drawing, a figure, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. Beneath it were the words, "Do not disturb the graves." Nathan dropped the notebook as though it burned him, his face pale as a ghost. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice cracking. I didn't argue. As we turned to retrace our steps, the forest seemed to come alive. The trees creaked and groaned as though shifting in the wind, though the air was eerily still. Low whispers began to ripple through the woods, too faint to understand but loud enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. And then came the laughter, soft at first, but growing louder, harsher, as though mocking our every step. We sprinted back toward the path, no longer caring about the noise we made. Branches clawed at our clothes, the underbrush snagging our shoes. I tripped once, my hands plunging into the dirt, but Nathan hauled me back up before I could even think about staying down. The forest felt endless, the shadows deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing, whatever it was, wasn't far behind us. Finally, we burst out of the trees onto the dirt trail, where we'd started earlier that day. The sight of it brought a rush of relief, so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. But as we stopped to catch our breath, something became terrifyingly clear. The laughter, it wasn't behind us anymore. It was ahead. It was coming from the direction of the car. Nathan and I exchanged a glance, our expressions mirroring the same grim realization. We didn't have a choice. We had to keep moving. Slowly, cautiously, we edged forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. The car came into view at the edge of the lot, but so did the figure. It was standing there, directly in front of the driver's side door, its head tilted slightly, as if watching us with curiosity. The glowing eyes were brighter now, reflecting the fading sunlight like embers in the dark. Nathan grabbed a rock from the ground, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "Get in the car. I'll distract it," he whispered. I wanted to argue, to tell him not to be stupid, but before I could speak, he hurled the rock toward the figure and screamed. The rock sailed through the air and passed right through, hitting the car with a hollow clang. The figure didn't move. Instead, it began to dissolve, like smoke unraveling in the wind, until nothing was left but the faint shimmer of its glowing eyes, now hovering in midair. We didn't stick around to see what would happen next. Nathan and I sprinted to the car, fumbling with the keys as the laughter echoed around us, bouncing off the trees like a cruel symphony. The moment the engine roared to life, we tore out of there, gravel spraying beneath the tires. The laughter didn't stop until we were miles down the road, fading into an unsettling silence. To this day, I don't know what we saw in that forest or why the graves were there. Nathan refuses to talk about it, and I can't blame him. But sometimes, late at night, I'll dream about that figure, its glowing eyes staring into me. And when I wake up, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of laughter in the distance. Story 2. Trail of Echoes. It was supposed to be a casual team-building exercise. Our boss, Monica, had the bright idea of taking us all on a weekend hiking trip to reconnect with nature and build synergy. I wasn't thrilled, to be honest. Spending my Saturday with coworkers, instead of catching up on sleep, wasn't exactly my idea of fun. But the company was paying for everything, and honestly, I needed the brownie points after screwing up a major report last quarter. So, there I was, trudging up some trail in the middle of nowhere, with 5 other people from my office, none of whom I really wanted to talk to. The trail started off easy, a wide dirt path winding through the forest, with birds chirping overhead and sunlight filtering through the trees. It actually wasn't bad at first. People were chatting, laughing, and Monica was her usual peppy self, pointing out random plants like she was some kind of botanist. I hung near the back with Derek, our IT guy, who was just as unenthusiastic about the whole thing as I was. "This feels like the beginning of a bad horror movie," he muttered, kicking a rock off the path. I laughed, but the words stuck with me. There was something about the woods, something too quiet, too still. We'd been hiking for about an hour when the path started getting narrower, the trees closing in around us. The air felt different, air cooler, heavier, like the forest was pressing down on us. That's when we heard it, laughter. It wasn't loud, just a faint chuckle carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was someone in our group, but when I looked around, everyone had stopped. Monica turned, her cheerful expression faltering. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked. We all nodded. The laughter had sounded close, but when we looked around, there was no one there. We all stood there for a moment, frozen. Monica tried to laugh it off, saying something about how sound carries wearily in the forest, but no one was convinced. The laughter didn't sound like an echo or a trick of the wind, sounded deliberate, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching us. Derek muttered something under his breath, but I caught enough to know it wasn't complimentary. We started walking again, but the mood had shifted. Conversations trailed off, and the cheerful atmosphere was replaced by an uneasy silence. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. The path kept getting rougher, almost like it hadn't been used in years. The underbrush grew thicker, and branches reached across the trail like skeletal hands. That's when we heard it again, the laughter. This time it was louder, sharper, and it was coming from behind us. Monica stopped and spun around, her face pale. "Okay, who's messing with us?" she asked, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably. No one answered. Derek turned to me, his eyes wide. "That didn't sound like any of us," he whispered. Monica decided we should keep going, though it was clear she was rattled. "Let's just get to the clearing up ahead," she said, her voice wavering. The clearing turned out to be a small open space, surrounded by dense trees, with no obvious way forward. We stopped to catch our breath, but the tension was palpable. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and circling us. The sound didn't come from one direction. It seemed to move around us, faster than any person could walk. Derek grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "This isn't funny anymore," he said, though no one was laughing. Monica tried calling out, her voice cracking as she shouted, "Hello, is someone there?" The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, came the laughter, again high-pitched, almost childlike, but wrong. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I could see the same unease on everyone else's faces. Whatever was out there, it didn't want us here. And it wasn't alone. That's when we saw it. A flash of movement between the trees. At first it was just a blur, like someone darting out of sight. Then there was another, and another. Shadows moved in the periphery, too fast to make out any details, but definitely human-shaped. "We need to leave," Derek said firmly, his voice louder now. Monica hesitated, looking like she wanted to argue. But even she couldn't deny that something was very wrong. "Back the way we came," she said finally. "We didn't need to be told twice." As we retraced our steps, the laughter and footsteps followed us, growing louder and more erratic. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches reaching out like they were trying to trap us. I felt like I was being watched from every angle, my skin crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes. Derek stayed close to me, his flashlight swinging wildly as he tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. Monica led the way, but she was practically jogging, her usual confidence replaced by sheer panic. The path we'd taken earlier was almost unrecognizable. It twisted in ways it hadn't before, leading us deeper into the woods, instead of out. Panic started to set in as we realized we were lost. The laughter turned into a cacophony, overlapping voices echoing all around us, too many to count. I swear I heard my name whispered among them. Soft, but unmistakable. "Keep moving," Monica yelled, her voice barely audible over the noise. I grabbed Derek's hand, afraid that if we got separated, I might not see him again. We kept moving, our steps frantic and uneven as the path twisted and turned in impossible ways. The laughter was relentless now, surrounding us, mocking us. Monica was several steps ahead, desperately scanning for any sign of the trailhead, but it was useless. The forest had changed. What had been a clear, albeit narrow, trail earlier was now a labyrinth of tangled roots and thick undergrowth. Derek tripped, pulling me down with him. And for a terrifying moment, I thought we wouldn't get back up. But the laughter grew louder, and that fear drove us to our feet again. Then we saw them. Figures stepped out from between the trees, their movements jerky, unnatural, like puppets controlled by an unseen hand. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were pale and featureless, blank slates that seemed to absorb the darkness around them. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but they stood there, blocking the way ahead. Monica froze, her breath hitching audibly. What do we do?" she stammered. No one answered. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might explode. But I couldn't take my eyes off the figures. They didn't move closer, but they didn't move away either. They just stood there, waiting. Derek grabbed my arm and pulled me to the side, off the path and into the dense trees. "We have to go around them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Monica followed reluctantly, her steps clumsy and hesitant. As we pushed through the thick underbrush, the figures didn't pursue us, but the laughter followed, growing distorted and echoing unnaturally through the trees. It was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was alive. Closing in on us, we stumbled into another clearing, our clothes torn and covered in scratches from the branches. This one was different and strong. In the center of the clearing was a crude ring of stones, and inside it, a fire burned low and blue, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Around the fire were more of the figures, their featureless faces turned toward us, as if they had been waiting for us to arrive. The air was thick with the smell of something acrid and metallic, making it hard to breathe. Monica whispered, "This isn't real. This can't be real," but her voice was drowned out by the rising sound of the laughter. Derek grabbed a branch from the ground, holding it in front of him like a weapon, though it was obvious it wouldn't do any good. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice trembling. I couldn't even respond, my throat dry and tight with fear. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. For the first time, it made a sound, a single, guttural laugh that sent a chill through my entire body. Then it pointed, a long, thin finger, directing us toward the fire. "We're not going near that thing," Monica said, but before she could take a step back, the ground beneath us began to shake. The laughter swelled, a crescendo of inhuman voices that made my ears ring. The figures moved closer, surrounding us, their movements synchronized and mechanical. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed Derek and Monica's hands and ran. Not toward the fire, not toward the figures, but blindly into the darkness, away from whatever was happening in that clearing. Somehow, we broke through. The trees thinned, the laughter faded, and the forest spat us out onto a dirt road. I don't remember much after that, only the sheer relief of seeing Monica's car parked at the edge of the trailhead. We didn't stop running until we were inside. The doors locked, the engine roaring to life. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them just for a moment. The figures stood at the edge of the forest, watching us leave, their blank faces reflecting the moonlight. We never talked about what happened that day. Not really. Monica quit her job a week later, and Derek transferred to another office. I stayed, but every time someone suggests another team-building event, I make an excuse. I don't go hiking anymore either. The forest is no longer a place of peace for me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint laughter outside my window, and I'll remember their blank faces, their silent steps, and the feeling of being watched. Story 3. Vanished Signals. I've always been a bit of a nerd for old tech. While most people my age are glued to their phones or gaming consoles, I've got a room full of vintage radios, oscilloscopes, and weird electronic gadgets that half the world's forgotten about. My buddy Tom is the same way. We've been friends since college, bonding over a shared love of amateur radio and hunting down old equipment at garage sales. Last fall, we decided to take our hobby to the next level. We packed up some of our best gear and headed out to a remote campsite in Utah to try and intercept signals bouncing off the atmosphere. Just 2 guys, a bunch of antennas, and a whole lot of static. The first 2 nights were uneventful, but in the best way possible. There's something soothing about sitting under the stars, listening to the crackle and hum of distant frequencies. We picked up a few random broadcasts mostly. Static interspersed with snippets of music or garbled voices in languages we couldn't quite place. Tom was fiddling with one of our handheld transceivers, muttering about improving the range, while I tuned through shortwave bands on a bulky receiver we'd rigged up with an old car battery. That's when it happened. A signal came through, loud and clear, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. At first, it sounded like a series of tones, mechanical, rhythmic, almost like Morse code, but not quite. Then came the voice. It was low and distorted, the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl, even if you can't explain why. 13.778, it said, the numbers drawn out slowly, followed by a burst of static. Then, the voice repeated, this time louder. 13.778. Do not respond. I looked at Tom, expecting him to laugh or call it some prank, but his face was pale, his eyes fixed on the receiver like he couldn't look away. Tom leaned closer to the receiver, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the tuning knob. The signal was strong, far too strong for something in the middle of nowhere. It's gotta be a numbers station, he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Numbers stations were cryptic, sure, but they were just leftover relics of Cold War espionage. This felt intentional. The voice repeated the coordinates again, clearer this time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for us. 13.778. Do not respond. A chill ran down my spine. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a notepad and wrote down the numbers. What are you doing? Tom asked, his voice sharp. I shrugged. Trying to play it off. Just in case, I said, though even I didn't believe that. The broadcast ended as abruptly as it had started, leaving nothing but static in its wake. Tom fiddled with the dials, scanning nearby frequencies, but there was nothing, just silence. It's probably some amateur messing with us, he said finally. But his hands didn't stop moving, the unease, obvious in his every motion. We tried to brush it off, but the signal had killed the mood. The night felt heavier, the darkness around us somehow thicker. Even the comforting crackle of the radio seemed ominous now. Around midnight, Tom suggested calling it a night. I agreed, though neither of us felt like sleeping. As I climbed into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods were silent, no wind, no animals, just an oppressive stillness that made every shadow seem alive. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was just the radio left on. But as I strained to listen, I realized it was something else entirely. A low, droning hum, like a power transformer or a far-off engine, was coming from somewhere in the forest. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat. The air was colder than it had been, and a faint glow pulsed through the trees. Like distant headlights. "Tom," I whispered, but there was no answer. His tent was empty, the flap wide open. Panic set in as I scanned the campsite. The hum was louder now, rhythmic and unsettling, and the glow seemed to pulse in time with it. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sound, calling out for Tom. The forest felt wrong, like it had shifted in some subtle but undeniable way. The trees seemed closer, the paths unfamiliar. Finally, I saw him standing in a clearing, perfectly still. "Tom," I shouted, relief flooding me, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at something in the distance. As I got closer, I realized he wasn't alone. A structure loomed in the center of the clearing, half buried in the earth. It was metallic, angular, and far too modern to be in a place like this. A faint vibration emanated from it, matching the hum that filled the air. Tom turned to me slowly, his face blank, his eyes glassy. "It's real," he whispered, his voice hollow. "The signal, it's coming from here." Before I could respond, a new sound broke through the hum, a sharp, piercing tone that made me drop the flashlight and cover my ears. Tom didn't react. He just walked toward the structure, his movements mechanical, like he was being pulled by an invisible force. I shouted for Tom to stop, but he didn't even flinch. It was as if he couldn't hear me, his gaze fixed on the strange structure. The piercing tone faded, replaced by a low whispering sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakably human, or at least it wanted to sound human. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, following Tom toward the structure. The metallic surface was covered in strange markings, etched deeply into the metal, almost like some kind of alien script. Tom reached the structure and placed his hand on it. The moment his fingers made contact, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, the pulsing glow around the clearing intensified, the air vibrating with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Tom, we need to go," I shouted, but he didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on something above the structure. I followed his gaze, and froze. The sky above us was no longer black, but a swirling vortex of light, a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to stretch endlessly into the heavens. Then came the voice, the same one from the radio, only now it was everywhere inside my head, vibrating in my chest. "You were warned," it said, the words slow and deliberate. "You should not have come." I stumbled backward, the weight of the voice pressing down on me like a physical force. Tom didn't move. He stood there, transfixed, as the vortex above us began to shift, the colors coalescing into a single blinding beam that shot down and enveloped the structure. I screamed for Tom, but the light was too intense, forcing me to shield my eyes. When it finally dimmed, I opened them and saw nothing. The structure was gone. Tom was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the faint smell of burnt metal lingering in the air. I ran to where the structure had been, my hands clawing at the dirt, but there was nothing, no trace that it had ever been there. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned in circles, calling out for Tom, but the forest was silent again, oppressive and empty. Desperation set in as I stumbled back to the campsite. The hum was gone, the air still and lifeless. When I reached our gear, I noticed something strange. The receiver was on, but it wasn't emitting static anymore. Instead, same rhythmic tones from earlier played softly, over and over, like a message on repeat. I grabbed the radio and smashed it against the ground, the frustration and fear boiling over. The tone stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I spent hours searching for Tom, shouting his name until my throat was raw, but it was no use. As dawn broke, I made my way back to the car, half expecting it to be gone too. But it was there, sitting at the edge of the trail like nothing had happened. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported Tom missing. They sent out a search team, but after 3 days, they found nothing, no tracks, no gear, no sign that he had ever been in the forest. When they questioned me, I didn't tell them about the structure or the signal. Who would believe me? It's been months now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. The numbers, the voice, the light, it's all burned into my memory. I've gone over it 100 times, trying to make sense of it, but the more I think about it, the less it feels real. The only thing I know for certain is that Tom is gone, and I'll never set foot in the woods again. Every now and then, late at night, I'll hear a faint hum, like the one from that night. And I'll wonder if it's calling to me, waiting for me to follow.